Welcome to episode 106 of the World Builders Anvil. Today's topic, language first cultural creation.
That's a lot of episodes.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builders Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. As always, I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and I'm here today with my special guest host,
Kristen Ingram.
Michael apologizes due to scheduling conflicts. We just could not get together this week. So my wife very, very bravely has decided to come on and help bring some banter to the show in an episode that would otherwise just feature me.
Banter.
And if you want to learn more about my wife, go to smallbizlife.com. And that's a podcast that we do together, which talks about sort of the weeds of how to get through the day-to-day machinations of small business.
It's good stuff. I'm not biased, though.
No, you're not biased at all. All right. Now let's jump straight into today's topic. And to warn you all, my wife looks like a deer in headlights right now because she is not a world builder. She likes some fantasy and science fiction, although I don't think she would consider herself even a guru of the subjects.
Well, in this, for me, it seems kind of counterintuitive to build the language first.
Yes.
So I think this is kind of interesting.
Yes, and she does like languages, and she watches lots of documentaries on cultures and languages with me. So she does have some expertise, albeit not in fantasy. She's a CPA.
I have studied 3 languages, though.
Yes.
I'll bring that. Those are my credentials for the episode.
Those are your credentials? So Italian, Spanish, I'm assuming.
And French.
French, okay. So 4 if you include English.
Yes.
Okay. But what a boring language that is.
English doesn't count.
Okay. Now, first I want to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration of the episode. And it really happened when we were on vacation together in Nashville from Christmas to New Year's. And we spent some time working in local coffee shops when we weren't touristing. I believe that's a word.
Sure.
I make it up for language if it's not. And I was working on the Siren culture, which if you go back just a couple episodes, Mike and I did a rebuild episode, I believe 2, I'll link those in the show notes, on rebuilding the Siren culture, which is a culture I knew a little bit about, but I'd never really done anything with them. They were sort of a marginal culture when I've used them in my world before, and I wanted to flesh them out some more, which brought me to this idea of their written language, which was tied back to another culture called the Mysteritas, which are some elves with a sort of a Mesoamerican flair. And their language I knew was sort of based off of Mayan.
Which is why you got the Mayan code book when we were down there.
Which is why I got the Mayan code book, which really made me wanted to work a little bit on their language. And the Mysteritas I've really never done a lot with either, too. There's sort of this, ancient culture of the past. They're still around in ways in the world, in the current setting I'm going to be deploying over the next year. The main thing was I didn't even really know a lot about them outside of a few details, but their language. And so I didn't really want to do their entire language because it's probably way too complex for me to do on my own. And I'm not going to get into too much detail on their language at this point. However, to give you some basic ideas is the Mayan language is not hieroglyphic. And if you look at it, you might think I'm crazy, in which case I would refer you back to either the documentary or the book called Breaking the Mayan Code. And they really kind of learned that the language exists at a couple different levels, which is one of the reasons why it was so hard to break it. It took a long time. Well, that and the Spanish kind of destroyed a lot of the evidence of it, but it is a alphabetic language. There are There are consonant sounds in the language as well. And there are ideograms, which are sort of your pictures that sort of form a word, kind of. So
A
sort
pictograph.
Sort of. But it's of idea. And
Okay.
so it's a very interesting language, but it started to force me to think about certain things, because one of the problems is, and I don't know who thought this idea up. I vaguely remember talking about this with Mr. Six, and it's this idea of what is language, and if you have multiple languages in your head, why don't you dream in both? And it's like, but when you dream, it's actually in words. You see pictures, but the pictures all have words attached to them. There's a great connection between our memory and words that we have, our vocabulary. So really, languages do end up being the pictures we dream in. And so certain types of things are really important. One, a numbering system, which I think blew my wife's mind when I spent an afternoon coming up with a very complicated numbering system for the Siren, which is a base 105. To put that in perspective, that is 95 more essentially numbers they have than we do. And then they'll start repeating once they get past the 105th character. Yes.
Well, I think too, when you think about cultures that are gone,
Yeah.
right? So if you think about like the Egyptian culture, the Mayan culture, the Incan culture, there are a couple things that are left, right? You have their architecture,
Mhm.
you have their art,
Mhm.
and you have their language.
Yeah.
Right? So it kind of makes sense to me that you would start with language, because if
Mhm.
you're thinking about a culture that's no longer with us,
Yeah.
then one of the primary things that we have to help understand who they were
Mhm.
is their language.
Yes, and sort of in line with that too, one of the things that sort of causes culture is essentially using the same sounds to represent the same things. So if I say man, and that means a male human of the species, and I meet someone else in the wilderness who uses man to mean the male of the human species, there's an understanding that we can have between us. And those are the kind of commonalities that sort of build up into early tribes, which end up leading into early cultures. So really, language and religious beliefs usually predate cultures. So they're good things to think about. However, there are some issues with doing a language first, but we'll talk more about that later.
Well, and I would imagine too that based on the complexity of the language, that can either be a deterrent to
Mhm.
interacting with others,
Yeah.
or it can help interact with others.
Mhm. And I don't know how true it was, but I believe I learned this in college history, so it can't be wrong. Probably a better source than the internet. It was this idea that the word barbarian comes from this idea where I believe it was the Greeks. It sounded like the barbarians who visited them just said bar, 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 bar. And so that's sort of, they were like, oh, barbars, and that sort of ended up becoming what we think of as a barbarian, or these unintelligible nitwits from somewhere else that have come to visit you.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so language is very important, and it tells a lot about a culture. And some of the interesting things I kind of came up with when I was doing this was I knew that there was a rigid class structure of essentially a warrior class. I knew there was a priest class, and I knew there was essentially the everyone else class. And I knew the priest class was at the top, and I knew that the warrior culture was sort of the second class, and then there were everyone else underneath them. So when I came up with the writing system, because it's a top-down written language, so if it was a sentence or a word, it'd be written the first character at the top of a line, and then all of the related characters would go underneath it. But instead of having one column, I decided to make three. And then I'm like, well, why would there be three? And three is an important cultural number to them because the sun and the moons are important to the Siren, or to the Mysteritos.
And there's one sun and two moons.
There's one sun and two moons.
Three.
And I like geometry. So I made the middle column, the sun, the most important column. which will add complexity in reading their language because you would read the first character, then you would read the last character, and then the middle character in any line before you move down. And so that would essentially represent one of the lines. The first one is the small moon, and then the far column is the big moon, and the middle column is the sun. And sometimes all three columns might not even have a character based on what they're doing. But there's always space for three, and they always represent those three things, and they really represent the class. I also learned that the language has three different levels of writing, much like the Mayans did. And that actually, those writing systems are based off of class again. So your peasantry folk, if they need to write anything, they write it in an alphabet form, the simplest form to write in. And this actually is the way they're allowed to communicate. If they were to use characters from the other alphabets, they would actually be breaking the law. And it's a bad thing. And the Mysteritos were an empire, sort of a Stone Age kind of empire, little blood crazy at times. Don't break the law. Not a good idea.
You'll end up a sacrifice.
You could end up a sacrifice. Most definitely. And I mean, it led me to really come up with, some basic concepts of about their calendar. Really, the thing I found is to have the basics of a language, it really kind of forces you to go into some of these cultural areas that you might not have thought of before. Now, if you go through my normal routine, you're going to hit all of these things. Like some of it is based off of astronomical cycles, because that obviously, if they're based off of Mesoamerican Indians, would have to be important. But it helped me explain their culture more. And then I could sit there and go, well, this is important to them. There are three parts to cycles, like your life starts with, childhood and then adulthood and then, your declining years. Even though they don't necessarily look at it the same way I do, but they see three parts in a person's life. And so the number three started becoming really, really important, which, in a way, sometimes I always try and shy away from, because in our own culture, the number three is kind of important. And obviously, the idea of the Trinity, Christianity is kind of important in the West, if you haven't noticed. And so sometimes I try and on purpose stay away from, when I don't want the culture to feel similar, I try and stay away from common things. But you know what? It makes sense. It just makes sense. And part of that could be my own limitation, but that's the way it's going to be from now on.
I think it's kind of important at this point that you didn't start with the language not knowing anything about the culture. You knew some things about the culture, but you used the language to help you develop the rest of the culture.
Yeah, I had a very basic thing. There are things about the Mysteritos in my world timeline. They don't have a specific timeline because I never developed one for them before. So I really don't know, what I like to call shared experiences, which is the first thing I normally start with the culture, is what is essentially the culture's history. And where this is a race-based culture, most of my cultures are not necessarily race-based. And there are definitely humans that share a similar culture. That has to be kept in mind as well, although the elves are sort of what is thought of, even in the world of Gardul, as this culture. I never really went into the shared symbolism outside. I knew the calendar was important. I knew there was a Mesoamerican influence. There were some things in my mind, but none of it had been fleshed out really before now. And I didn't really even have written down what the shared beliefs and norms were, because I kind of thought, oh, they're just kind of Aztecs. And they're not even really kind of just Aztecs, because they're not that bloodthirsty. They're not killing 50 to 100,000 people a year to keep the sun revolving around, which is good. But, still, and sometimes people get squeamish around the idea of blood sacrifices. And probably whenever I release written material, I will never have graphic depictions of blood sacrifices. Almost every Stone Age religion has blood sacrifices, at least in our world. Your world doesn't have to be the same, But just keep that in mind, as typically as cultures evolve, this shared idea of if I don't kill you, you don't kill me buries in a bit deeper and becomes stronger, which is probably why, the Norwegians today, are probably some of the most peaceful people on earth. But, you go back to, like 900 AD and you don't want to get visited from somebody from Norway.
I think you make an interesting point, though, that when you're developing your cultures, most ancient cultures had something that they did to try to appease their gods.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Whether it was giving them part of the harvest, blood sacrifices, something like that. So you have to make sure that when you have cultures that are more primitive, that have very strong gods that they think are very influential, what is motivating that god to make the sun come up, to make the crops, grow? Especially
in a polytheistic society, you're playing gods off of each other. So if you're trying to protect yourself from one god, you look to the mythology of the culture's religion and go, well, who's his antithesis god? And maybe we'll worship that god because the god of floods is a jerk. But some of the commonalities you'll find in looking at earth culture, typically the tougher the geography a culture is in, the tougher the religion. Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, Norway, big places for blood sacrifices. Egypt, strangely not. It's maybe the only one I've studied that I don't know of recorded blood sacrifices. But even some of the ones that you don't think about, Rome, please just go to the Colosseum.
Those weren't blood sacrifices. That was entertainment.
That was entertainment, yes. And they can work for both. China, very early on, was renowned, like when, a great leader would die, wives and slaves would sort of get chucked into the tomb with them. That's a form of blood sacrifice. Now, that was a form of ancestor worship as much as anything. So even in non-polytheistic religions, a lot of times early on, there are some form of blood sacrifices. The Druids in England were accused by the Romans of being very bloodthirsty, like sacrificing children on the battlefield before battle. Now, whether or not that's true isn't completely verified. However, I think archaeologists are starting to lean to the fact that the Druids were actually kind of a bloody religion. And once again, it's a lot tougher to survive in the Stone Age. The thing is, so to them, that probably was somewhat reflective on the need of protection they needed. And maybe some ways it helped protect their tribes from being destroyed from overpopulation. It was maybe a way to help thin out the herd. And I hate to put it quite that way, but I'm sure it was maybe accidentally that. Mm-hmm. But, whether it's your foes on the battlefield or whether it is your children or your elderly, and whether it even appears like a blood sacrifice, there's usually some form of people being sacrificed. And, it's up to you if you want to apply that to your world. And it's also up to you, if you want to be graphic. I don't want to be graphic about that. But, it's something that does exist. And in a naturalistic world building scenario, you're probably going to have blood sacrifices in older cultures. As they develop, they'll probably become shunned, which is a good thing. It was probably around the 12th century AD when, the Scandinavians are like, this whole berserking thing, no, that's illegal now. Sometime around there, it started becoming outlawed as Christianity spread through the area, which was not a Stone Age religion. But it sort of really toned down the sort of pagan idiosyncrasies of Norway and of all of Scandinavia. So those are some things to think about, and the great thing about culture is that's why I'm a culture first person, and I separate it from everything, even when they're very tightly coupled, because cultures grow and evolve. So if you take one culture, it could be very bloodthirsty, and, a few centuries later, a millennium later, they're not. Probably. And if they are, that's one of the things you have to explain. Why are they not evolving away from that when typically you do? because normally society learns behaviors and they learn what works, what doesn't. You go to medieval Italy, you're going to get stabbed with a stiletto. Now you're probably just going to get pickpocketed. That's a massive improvement. And I'm joking. I love Italy. But they do warn you of pickpockets if you ever visit there. Now, we've kind of covered a little bit of why I like it. But let's step back to reordering cultures. So if I was to do a language first, I would start there. There are some great books on languages you'll find back in episode 16 that will actually help you develop either Western style or non-Western style languages. And really, it's not fair calling it Western style, either alphabetic or non-alphabetic languages.
Well, and I think, too, it makes you think about the type of tools that the culture had. So, if they didn't have paper, then they're probably carving into something.
Yeah.
And that will influence the shape of their, the shape of their letters.
And that was one of the interesting things. And I think I shocked Kristen one night. I was going through the language construction kit because I'm not a natural linguist. So I was sitting in bed with like this piece of wood and a knife, and I was carving into wood. And the reason was the first language I was working on was a group that they wrote mainly into wood. So, you can't have curved letters in wood. Now you can get there with magic and you can kind of cheat if you use magic. Don't get me wrong, but I don't like that. I like the idea of it being naturalistic. So I was literally carving shapes into wood. Some of them kind of look like letters that you might see and some might not, because there's really only so many ways you can make a straight line. And so knowing, is stone where it's meant to be written? Is paper where it's meant to be written? Is wood or some other substance where it's meant to be written? Know that, and that will actually help influence the language as well, too. If you have this very permanent or this very impermanent idea of culture, where maybe the culture has no artwork that lasts. And there are cultures like that on Earth where, you make this thing out of sand and over time it just goes away. Or you make a garden and over time it grows and it changes. If you have a culture that way, they're probably not going to write into stone or wood. They're going to maybe write into sand. And as long as it's there, it's there. And when it's gone, it's gone. So keep these things in mind.
Well, do you also think, too, like if a culture writes into stone or wood, that there'd be fewer changes to their language over time than one that uses paper?
Absolutely not. Because the thing that changes language are the introduction to new ideas. And as long as that's happening, language will keep changing. So as long as things are being invented, as long as you're growing out and meeting new cultures, you'll come up with new ideas, new words, and even new sounds.
Okay.
So languages will change. Like, that's the reason why, like, if you go back to English, from when it really first started showing up, around the age of the Vikings is when English started showing up as a language. And try and read it. Good luck. Mm-hmm. It looks like a foreign language because it is.
Yeah.
But it really is what developed into what we speak today. But the idea is I would move language to first, and then I would go through my sequence, the way I did in chapter 13 from there. I'd go into shared experiences. But I'd probably have a mechanism to write it down, because you might think of things, in those areas as you're writing. You'll be forced to think of those things. And if you follow a sequence for creating a language, you'll be forced to think about why is the object, if I'm doing an object, verb, subject, sentence, if that's the construction of their language, why is the object more important to the subject? Because, most languages, subject comes before object. Now, the verb order is sometimes screwed up, but usually subjects before object. But maybe there are reasons why you have a culture that actually does object first. And you can do it however you want to. Just think why. Why is it important? And that might give you a shared experience that you want them to have, or a shared symbology, or a shared belief. It will help flesh out some of those other areas before you get to them. So if you do a language first, it's, great to have a notebook, or, have a few tabs set up in your Evernote, or however you do it. to start putting those other ideas in so you don't lose them as you're thinking about the language. We talked a little bit about why we like it, and now I want to talk a little bit about when do you want to avoid this?
When you don't want to make a language?
No. I could see you. There are reasons to not make a language, but I'm not going to go into those because I like languages in my fantasy. But when do you avoid doing a language first culture? One, if you've never developed a language before, you have no idea what you're doing, probably not a good way to start developing. If you have no inspiration for the language, you might want to try anyway. But, if you sit there for 10 minutes and you're going, blah, 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 just stop and go, you know what, I'm going to do this a different way. I'll get to the language later. And the good thing is, whenever you get to the language, it will help flesh out your culture because it will force you to look at things that you speak about in your own life, but it doesn't have to be first. But if you have an idea, you want some relationship to an existing language, or you have some ideas of the culture, that's when you want to do it. But when you don't have those things in place, unless you're a natural linguist, which there are, I would probably avoid using this technique to start off with. But if you have an idea of at least the language, it will force you to think about the culture.
And I would imagine too, if you're writing and they're a very small part of the work, so if your character is traveling and they run into some orcs and it's like it's a 5-minute passage in the book, I don't think you need to spend hours and hours trying to develop the language of these particular orcs. No. For this 5-minute passage in the book.
Well, it's always the purpose. So if your purpose is what I like to call, an architect style world, a world where essentially you've created a framework for stories to happen in, while you're in the middle of a work, do not waste your time. However, if you have the language showing up, keep that somewhere.
Yeah.
Because you want to try and build that into your language.
So if the orc says, Bajo Boogie,
yes,
you want to make sure you write that down because when you develop the language later on, you have to work that in somewhere.
And you have to make the lines make sense to you. And
consistency.
And the good thing is it doesn't need to make sense to the character because the character could have taken it out of context. Maybe they find orcs threatening, which would be uncommon in most fantasy fiction. Not really. But what they're actually saying and what the person takes it to mean might not match up 100%. But you'd probably want to know what it meant, in English and what the actual words you used were. Now for the world building task of the year, of the episode.
I was like, wow, for the year. Whew. I don't know though, because this could take you a year.
No. And the thing is, you don't have to do all steps of the languages, but if it takes you more than a couple weeks to develop a language, you're either trying to recreate an actual fully functioning language that should have developed over thousands of years for a culture, and which you'll never do, or you're working in circles. That's the reason why I have a plan before you create a language. Go back to episode 13. Episode 16 on languages, and make sure to have a game plan when you go in to do it, or else you're going to be spinning your wheels, even if you're a natural linguist, because you're going to think way too much about colors and where colors might be important, and you want to know what some colors are. You don't need to break out the crayon box and go, okay, cyan. What should I call cyan? You don't need to do that.
Well, and if you think, if you think about learning languages, the first things you learn when you learn a language is you learn the alphabet, you learn the number system, you learn things like the name for man and woman and boy and girl, so if you kind of think of it from that perspective, get like an old intro to French book or intro to Italian book and look at the things that they cover in the first couple chapters. those are the kinds of things I would imagine that you'd want to focus on when you're building a language.
And as always, I will tell you the cheat that was told to me, and that is, if you're not a great linguist person, or even if you are, don't be afraid to sit there and go, let me pick a language and sort of steal its grammar. I'll make up sounds for it, and I'll modify it to my needs. That way, I'm not recreating every part of it.
Right.
And if nothing else, if you can't, afford a giant textbook of 10,000 language grammars, or you can't remember the name of it, then Wikipedia will give you enough. Think about the sounds that you want the words to, or the words, and they don't need to match up with that language. But use the language for grammar, like word order and stuff like that, and make it affect your culture.
But I would even think just simple things like, what would you write on, so you kind of get an idea for shape of letters. Yep. Do you want it to be a harsh sounding language? Do you want it to be a soft sounding language? Do you want it to be romantic? Do you want it to just kind of like dribble out of their mouth? Even just things like that, you learn a lot about a culture just from things like that.
And that's why when you're doing it, either in the normal sequence of building a culture, if you go back to episode 13, or if you're doing this language first approach, understand that it's going to tweak your culture, because there are words, just the idea of how do you deal with certain verbs like was, to be. I mean, when you start dealing with very abstract concepts, if they are in the language, how do you deal with adjectives? Maybe they don't have adjectives. Some languages didn't have adjectives. How does that affect a culture? Does it change the way they perceive things? And probably not, but it can. So let it be inspiration to you. And now for the real world task of the day. Be thankful and also grateful. And the idea is be thankful for things that you have in your life. And no matter how chaotic your life is, no matter how bad your life is, there are always some parts of it that are working good. It's sort of like the economy. If you have a depression, some parts of the economy are doing great. Just most of it is not.
Well, it's funny because in the Small Biz Life group on Facebook, we do Monday motivation. And, some people are like, oh, I hit, I did this, I got sales. And it was funny, last week somebody was like, I got out of bed and I showered. And I was like, some days that is something awesome to be thankful for.
Yeah, exactly. And look for those things to be thankful for, because those are the things that will remind you that maybe your life is horrific at the moment. But if you can be thankful for just one thing a day, and maybe it is just that shower and getting up and showering, be thankful for it, and don't be ungrateful either, towards that thing. Don't be ungrateful to people who help you, even ones you don't know. It might be the janitor who keeps the hallway clean in your apartment building or where you work. It might be the clerk who you walk past every day at work, who gets paid a lot less money than you do, and you don't think twice about, or the security guard who's really probably underpaid, in the building that you work at.
It could be that cup of coffee that you have first thing in the morning.
Well, I don't think you have to say that one, because I think most coffee drinkers are always
are thankful for their coffee.
And if not, the first time it's out of sequence, then they become grateful again.
But
yeah,
there have been a lot of studies that show that if you intentionally bring gratitude and thankfulness into your life, you have a much more positive perception. You actually have more energy, because negativity and always focusing on what's bad in your life actually drains a lot of energy from you, and a lot of creative energy as well.
Explaining why. I don't usually do that. But yes, that's exactly it. And now for the tease, which my wife is quite annoyed with, that this is not the episode she's doing.
Yeah, Mike might not be available for scheduling next week either.
But next week is the Fallout 4 World Review. Now, I have done a Fallout World Review before, where I kind of covered what had been covered in the games to date through Fallout New Vegas. But now Fallout 4 is out. I want to add to it and talk a little bit, and mainly specifically about the lands in which Fallout 4 take place, which I will not say to spoil it until next episode. And as always, make sure to go to Garduel.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us in this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at Garduel.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.